Just after dawn in Fort Pierce, Florida, federal agents were already waiting at the inlet. Their target was a convoy of 3 boats crossing back from the Bahamas, part of what investigators called one of the most organized smuggling missions in recent years. On those decks were 30 Chinese nationals, including 2 children, along with 5 Bahamian crew members. Hidden in compartments lay 168 kilograms of cocaine, worth millions on the U.S. market. Authorities warned that if these vessels had reached shore, the impact would have stretched far beyond Florida, threatening both community safety and border security. Yet by acting together, the FBI, DEA, Homeland Security, and local deputies stopped the mission before it landed. How did this single mission grow so large, and what chain of events led agents to strike that morning? Subscribe Military Power to uncover the full story behind the operation. In recent years, tighter measures have been enforced along the U.S. Mexico land border. Smuggling groups have sought new routes through the Caribbean Sea. The Bahamas, located just about 50 miles from Florida and made up of hundreds of islands, has quickly become a transit hub for both narcotics and migrants. From short-term rental houses to disguised fishing boats, smuggling networks have evolved into professional operations with detailed planning and lookout teams. Against this backdrop, Fort Pierce Inlet became the scene of one of the largest joint missions involving the FBI, the DEA, and local law enforcement, aimed at severing a crucial link in a transnational pipeline. Florida's East Coast became the scene of a large federal operation when multiple agencies combined to dismantle a transnational smuggling network. The Drug Enforcement Administration, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and Homeland Security joined forces with local deputies under Sheriff Richard Del Toro of St. Lucie County. Their target was not a small group of opportunists, but an organized system moving both narcotics and migrants across the sea from the Bahamas into American waters. By the time the mission reached its climax, dozens of suspects were in custody, and a carefully designed smuggling route had been exposed. From the start, investigators treated the case as more than a routine bust. Intelligence reports pointed to professional coordination, including support teams on shore and rental houses used as command centers. What looked like an ordinary Airbnb in Fort Pierce was in fact a planning hub where routes were mapped and vessels assigned. Federal and state agencies kept the house under surveillance, gathering information on movements, contacts, and timing. This patient approach reflected a larger strategy: strike only when the full picture of the operation was visible, ensuring that the entire chain could be broken at once. On the water, the Coast Guard and U.S. Customs Air and Marine operations prepared for interception. Crews had monitored activity in Bahamian waters and tracked the departure of several high-speed boats as they crossed into the Gulf Stream. These vessels were not typical fishing craft, but center console boats favored by traffickers for their speed and range. Equipped with multiple outboard engines, they could carry both people and cargo while blending in with ordinary marine traffic. By coordinating air patrols and surface units, law enforcement created a dragnet that stretched from the beaches of Fort Pierce out into federal waters. The sheriff later emphasized that this type of joint action proved how effective cooperation could be when local resources and federal tools were combined. Each agency brought unique capabilities. The FBI and DEA managed the intelligence side, the Coast Guard supplied maritime interdiction, and local deputies handled immediate arrests and community security. This blend ensured that the case would hold up in court, while also sending a wider message to trafficking networks watching from abroad. Officials described the operation as one of the most complex maritime conspiracies disrupted in recent years, underlining the scale of the challenge facing coastal law enforcement. The inlet became the site of a coordinated interception by federal and local forces. The scene marked the beginning of a larger story that would soon reveal the depth of the smuggling network, the identities of those involved, and the desperate measures taken to evade capture. But what exactly happened when the 3 boats appeared on the horizon near Fort Pierce, and how did one vessel attempt a daring escape? As dawn broke over Fort Pierce Inlet, 3 fast boats returned from the Bahamas, cutting across the waves with the confidence of vessels that had made this trip before. Federal agents were already in position, having tracked their movement across the Gulf Stream. The mission had been set for this exact moment, when all the boats converged near the channel, and every exit could be blocked at once. The first vessel was a 42-foot contender, designed for speed and offshore range, its triple outboard engines pushing it through the tide. Beside it traveled a 36-foot Grady White, a cabin cruiser more often seen with weekend fishermen, but on this run it carried far more than fishing gear. These two slowed as Coast Guard patrol craft surged into their path, sirens flashing and spotlights cutting the morning haze. Operators on board made the choice to comply, bringing their throttles down and allowing boarding teams to move in without resistance. The third boat, a 33-foot Intermarine, reacted differently. Instead of cutting power, its crew pushed the throttles forward, sending the hull crashing against the swells as it tried to race past the blockade. The sudden move transformed the calm inlet into a chase. Customs, Air, and Marine Operations agents swung into pursuit, their interceptors accelerating hard while air units tracked the fleeing target from above. Radio commands coordinated each move, closing the escape routes before the smaller craft could reach open water. The Intermarine attempted to flee but was quickly stopped. But law enforcement had prepared for that possibility, and within seconds, disabling fire struck the outboards, leaving the boat dead in the water. Agents boarded swiftly, securing the crew before they could attempt further resistance. The chase lasted less than a minute, but it underscored how determined smugglers were to test American defenses. On shore, surveillance units observed counter teams stationed on the beaches, men positioned to watch the inlet and report law enforcement movements. These spotters were part of the wider conspiracy, proving the smuggling mission had been carefully mapped in advance. By detaining them alongside the boat crews, investigators ensured that no part of the network remained untouched. The coordination between sea, air, and land units demonstrated why the operation was described as one of the most sophisticated maritime interdictions seen in the region. When the 3 vessels were finally secured, agents faced the task of uncovering exactly what lay inside. The answer would reveal not just contraband, but a disturbing picture of how far this network had gone to profit from both narcotics and human desperation. So what did investigators find once they climbed aboard, and why did the discovery shock even veteran officers? The next part explains the scale of what was hidden within those boats. Once the 3 boats were secured, boarding teams moved quickly to inspect the decks and cabins. What they uncovered inside the vessels confirmed the scale of the smuggling operation. Packed tightly into the cramped spaces were 30 Chinese nationals, including 2 children, who investigators said were attempting to reach U.S. soil without authorization. The presence of minors drew particular attention, as it showed that entire families were being drawn into the dangerous crossings organized by criminal groups. Alongside the migrants, 5 Bahamian men were taken from the vessels, while 3 more were detained from counter-surveillance teams on the beach. Their role was to monitor the inlet, watching for patrols and relaying information to the crews at sea. By bringing them into custody, agents ensured that not only the transporters but also the support elements of the network were neutralized. The cargo found beneath seat cushions and stored in compartments was equally alarming. Investigators reported seizing 168 kilograms of cocaine, about 370 pounds in total, concealed in coolers and luggage. For law enforcement, the discovery was evidence that the mission was designed as a dual stream: narcotics hidden beside migrants, both treated as cargo to be moved across the Gulf Stream with little regard for safety or legality. The combination meant the profits were multiplied, since drugs brought a high price on the streets, while each migrant represented tens of thousands of dollars for smugglers. Agents described the scene on deck as a stark example of how modern smuggling blends human desperation with criminal enterprise. The migrants had been placed alongside narcotics in the same confined space, exposed to risk from both the sea and the smugglers' tactics. According to federal officials, this was one of the clearest demonstrations yet of cartels exploiting multiple markets at once, fueling drug supply while also monetizing migration. Each person on board had already paid or been forced to promise payment for the dangerous trip, while the cocaine was bound for distribution channels across the southeast. By the end of the inspection, all evidence was documented, and every individual was transferred into federal custody. Migrants were expected to be processed and repatriated under U.S. law, while the Bahamian suspects faced charges linked to trafficking and conspiracy. The cocaine was logged and secured as material evidence, marking another blow against the wider network operating between the islands and Florida. Sheriff Del Toro later called the seizures unprecedented in scale for his county, emphasizing that coordination had allowed authorities to stop both narcotics and undocumented migration in a single strike. But how had such an elaborate mission been organized from inside Florida itself? And where was the hidden command post that tied the vessels and surveillance teams together? Behind the drama on the water stood a quiet suburban house that investigators say held the key to the entire mission. What appeared to neighbors as an ordinary short-term rental was in fact a temporary headquarters for a network that linked Florida to the Bahamas and beyond. Detectives who had tracked the house for days observed a steady flow of men carrying supplies, holding late-night meetings, and preparing for the departure of the boats. When the raids concluded, law enforcement confirmed that 38 suspects were in custody. This number included the crews from the 3 intercepted vessels, as well as those captured on shore. Federal agencies explained that the arrests were coordinated to happen at once, so no part of the organization could slip away. By striking at sea and on land at the same time, authorities neutralized the immediate threat and also gathered evidence to map the larger network. Court filings later revealed that the Airbnb property had been rented just days before the crossing. Inside, investigators found communication devices, travel documents, and notes describing pickup points in the Bahamas. According to law enforcement, the location was chosen precisely because it blended into a coastal community where visitors often come and go without raising suspicion. Sheriff Richard Del Toro highlighted this discovery as proof that traffickers were adapting quickly, exploiting civilian infrastructure while trying to hide their true purpose. The arrests marked a turning point for local authorities. For St. Lucie County deputies, the case demonstrated that close cooperation with federal partners brought tangible results. In recent years, some of these partnerships have been stretched thin, but the Fort Pierce operation showed what could be achieved when agencies moved in lockstep. The message was direct. Surveillance is constant, coordination is strong, and those attempting to test U.S. waters will be intercepted. For the individuals arrested, the legal path ahead was complex. Federal prosecutors prepared charges ranging from drug importation to conspiracy and aiding unlawful entry. The cocaine seized became critical evidence in building cases that reached far beyond St. Lucie County, pointing to links with international suppliers. By treating the Airbnb as both a crime scene and a hub of intelligence, investigators aimed to trace the pipeline back to its sources. Yet the question remained, how much money was involved in persuading people to risk everything for a place on those boats? And what did each migrant pay to make the dangerous crossing? While the arrests drew headlines, the financial side of the operation showed why such missions continue despite the risks. According to federal investigators, each migrant paid between $30,000 and $35,000 for a single seat on the crossing from the Bahamas to Florida. For criminal networks, this meant that even one small boat carrying a dozen passengers could generate hundreds of thousands of dollars in profit. Combined with the cocaine hidden on board, the sums reached levels that made the dangers worthwhile for traffickers. The model often began with a plane ticket. Migrants arrived in the Bahamas legally, taking advantage of easier visa rules compared to direct entry into the United States. Once on the islands, they were approached by brokers who promised a final leg across the Gulf Stream. Payment was collected up front, sometimes in cash, sometimes through loans secured by family members. U.S. officials explained that this pattern has become increasingly common, with people from China, the Caribbean, and even Africa using the same route. For many families, the cost represented everything they owned. Investigators reported cases where property was sold or relatives pooled savings to cover the fee. In return, passengers were told they would arrive quickly and quietly on Florida's shores. The reality, however, was that they were crammed into unsafe vessels alongside narcotics with little regard for their safety. Authorities highlighted this contrast as evidence of how smugglers profited twice, once from narcotics and again from desperate migrants seeking a better life. By involving children, smugglers showed a willingness to use families as leverage, knowing that law enforcement would act with caution in operations involving minors. Agents emphasized that the inclusion of 2 young passengers in the Fort Pierce case illustrated how cartels blended humanitarian cover with criminal cargo. Officials also stressed that every rescue and repatriation was carried out under strict procedures designed to protect those found on board, while ensuring that criminal organizers faced prosecution. Sheriff Richard Del Toro described the financial scale of the operation as staggering for a coastal county, noting that the combination of drug proceeds and migrant payments made the network both wealthy and resilient. Analysts pointed to the challenge this created. As long as the profits remained high, organizations would keep investing in new methods, new boats, and new routes. The case showed how economics drove the trade as much as geography, and why enforcement at sea was becoming more critical with every month. But if the money explained why smugglers took the risk, another question remained. Why had they shifted from land routes to the open sea? And what trends convinced federal agencies that the Bahamas would become the next front line? The final section explores the changing map of smuggling and how the sea has replaced the desert as the preferred path. The Fort Pierce case was not an isolated event, but part of a larger shift in the way smuggling networks operate. For years, most trafficking into the United States focused on the land border with Mexico, yet tighter controls and increased patrols there forced cartels to look for alternatives. Federal data show that drug seizures at land crossings fell from 453 in July 2024 to just 331 in July 2025. At the same time, maritime and air seizures surged, with more than 800 already logged halfway through the year. Officials warned that if the trend continued, 2025 would break every previous record for interdictions at sea. Geography explains why the Bahamas became a focal point. With over 700 islands scattered across shallow waters, the chain provides countless launch points within easy reach of Florida. The distance from Bimini to Miami is only about 50 miles, short enough for a high-speed boat to cover in under 2 hours. For traffickers, the archipelago offers both cover and convenience. Lenient visa rules allow migrants from Asia, Africa, and Latin America to arrive legally, while smugglers blend among legitimate tourist traffic before making the final crossing. Nature, however, makes this route dangerous. The Florida Current, part of the Gulf Stream, pushes an immense flow of water northward between the islands and the U.S. coast. When strong winds come from the opposite direction, steep waves rise quickly and small vessels can capsize without warning. Coast Guard pilots described how these conditions turned rescue missions into life-or-death searches across vast stretches of ocean. The risks did not deter traffickers because the profits from narcotics and migrant fees far outweighed the dangers to those on board. U.S. agencies responded by strengthening cooperation with Bahamian authorities. Joint patrols, shared intelligence, and rapid repatriation agreements became central to keeping the corridor under control. Coast Guard statements echoed the same point. The waters off Florida are under constant watch, and anyone attempting to exploit them will face swift action. The Fort Pierce takedown showed that even sophisticated planning could be unraveled when agencies acted together. Still, the underlying challenge remains. The sea is vast, the incentives are high, and the networks are flexible. Yet a question lingers. How long can enforcement stay ahead of criminal innovation, and what new tactics will traffickers attempt when the next wave comes? From the quiet rental house in Fort Pierce to the high-speed chase at sea, this operation showed how coordination between federal and local forces can break even the most complex smuggling pipeline. 30 migrants, narcotics worth millions, and dozens of arrests prove the scale of the challenge, but also the strength of America's response. Each action followed strict law and procedure, ensuring both security and humanity. The lesson is clear. Teamwork can outpace criminal innovation. For more stories where strategy meets reality, like, share, and subscribe to Military Power, and join us as we uncover the battles shaping tomorrow.